Hey everybody, this is Sophia Florence, one of the hosts of the Crumbling podcast, and I'm here to tell you that we have new tiers on Patreon. And I know what you're thinking. Do I want to pay more for this podcast? Hell yeah, because you're going to get some cool shit with it. Our early supporter tier is now one of the new ones. Obviously, we have the old Help Us Grow one, which is just $3 a month. That gives you access to our episodes early and gives you access to our special episodes called Crumbs. The early supporter tier, which is $6 a month, gives you early access to the episodes like the other one, gives you some exclusive behind-the-scenes content. So there could be clips, bloopers, more other things that we'll be adding to the Patreon. A physical sticker pack, which is fun and themed designs produced by our illustrator, Chris Terendi. Patreon-only updates and polls that'll help shape our future content. So that'll be really exciting if you want to kind of be more of an active participant in what we're doing here. And it's, just kind of a perfect thing for fans who want a sneak peek and exclusive goodies. There's some really fucking cool designs. I can't wait till y'all see them. If you want to go a little bit more than that, we have the super fan tier that is $20 a month. That gives you early access to all the episodes. It gives you those behind the scenes episodes and extras. It'll give you access to something that the other ones don't have, which is a limited edition t-shirt. We've got one right now. It's super cool. I am not even going to show it to you guys. Probably have more designs over the years. If you want the shirt, come get it. It's $20 a month for that. Ideal for anyone who loves merch. They want to, tell people about our podcast and they don't want to actually talk about it. Some of us are introverts. You don't want to talk about shit. You just want to be a billboard, and I'm cool with that. And also, it's the same art that's on the stickers. It is super rad, and 40% of the tier's proceeds go directly to supporting our illustrator's work. That is Chris Terendi. He's at Chris Terendi, Tirendi art.com. ChrisTerendiart.com. Give it a look. I hope that some of you will join, and I hope that you will take part in some polls and tell us what you want. We want to make the content that you want within the confines of the stuff that we like to do. Please go to our Patreon, patreon.com/The Crumbling Podcast, and join today. Everybody, welcome to The Crumbling Podcast. It is a podcast about how our sense of reality is crumbling and maybe, just maybe, what we could do about it. I'm one of your hosts, Sophia Florence, and I'm here with my co-hosts.
Hey, it's Davin.
Hey, it's V.
Glad to have you guys with me, and I have been really, really excited about this and have kind of kept it close to the chest. I rarely get to say that I think someone's work is necessary reading for understanding the moment we're in, but our guest today is somebody whose work is without a doubt something that you really should read. He's an author of a number of books. The recent three are most interest, what we're going to be talking about. They're called On Humanity, Making Monsters, and Less Than Human. There's subtitles to those books, but they're a bit long, so I figured I'd save you guys the details. He's also a professor of philosophy at New England University. David Livingstone Smith. How are you doing tonight?
Well, so far, so good. Well,
excellent. I'm super happy to have you with us. I want to give an explanation of David's work and why it's relevant to us. This podcast is traditionally on the epistemic crisis, which I don't use that word that often, but really on how our sense of reality is collectively falling apart. And the consequences of that. I think one of the worst consequences, something that we started to talk about in our arc on Gamergate, is dehumanization campaigns. Ultimately, when people start to pull apart your sense of reality, it creates a bridge between you and other people and causes you to be more susceptible to dehumanizing other people. And David's work has really, really gone into depth on dehumanization. I know that's kind of a heavy subject matter, but I hope you guys will stick with us and enjoy what we're about to do.
All right. Can you please give us a succinct definition of what dehumanization is? Or is that even possible to give?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with, because the word dehumanization is used in lots and lots and lots of different ways, even among scholars. And then when you broaden it out, say you Google dehumanization, you find it can mean almost anything. Now, there's not a wrong meaning and a right meaning. They're just various opinions on how to use the word and how to use the concept. So for me, dehumanization is an attitude. That is, it happens in people's heads. And it's the attitude of thinking of others, normally groups of others, as less than human creatures.
Okay, that's a real solid one.
That's perfect.
You're very good at this, because I will have rambled.
I've been doing this a while.
So I really am actually very curious about this. How did you get into studying this kind of thing? And what kinds of philosophical work were you doing prior to this?
Okay. Well, that's a little bit complicated, the first part of your question. So there are two aspects to the answer. One is that I grew up in the Deep South in the 50s and 60s. And the Deep South in the 50s and 60s was palpably, horribly racist. Now, I wasn't acculturated into Southern culture. My parents moved with me down from New York City when I was 3 or 4. And what I witnessed growing up left a profound mark on me. And one of the things that really helped me was actually my grandmother's education of me. Now, my grandmother, both my paternal grandparents were Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. My grandmother, although she had to leave school at the age of 14 to help support the family, was a brilliant, self-educated woman with a profound interest in racism, anti-Semitism, and so on. So she really helped me understand the world that I was thrown into when we moved to the South. That's the sort of the autobiographical background. But more proximately, around about 2005, I was working on a book on war, and I came across all these examples of dehumanizing wartime propaganda representing enemies as game animals or vermin or vicious predators and so on. And I thought, gosh, this is really interesting. I need to look into this further. And I found that virtually all the literature was being done by social psychologists. And I had some issues with how they were addressing this phenomenon. And so one evening I was having dinner with a friend and he said, David, this has got to be your next book. Everyone will have to cite you. Because I said to him, look, there's no book in the English language specifically on dehumanization. So that's how I got into it. And there's a lot of work to be done. I don't see myself ending this investigation in the foreseeable future. Now, what was I doing before then? Well, I've actually had 2 careers. I was a psychotherapist before moving into philosophy. So I wrote largely about psychoanalysis and Freud and so on. And when I moved into philosophy, I was basically interested in what we call philosophy of psychology, philosophy of psychoanalysis, and things like self-deception. So that's kind of the background.
Wow, that's interesting. I first heard about your work from a friend who's into the philosophy of psychology. He was kind of a New Haven notable, Chris Schuck. I feel like folks around town may know who it is, but everyone else may be totally clueless. But he talked to me about your work in 2020 and said, listen, this is something you've got to read because, myself and the producer here also like to work on horror movies. And I had an interest in this idea that our perception of what we call monsters is maybe, misinformed. And you could see some of that kind of thing in like Guillermo del Toro's movies and some other folks that I think take this kind of magical realism approach, or even Gabriel Garcia Marquez. There's this talk about things that are not quite human, but there's not something necessarily evil about them. And it's more of a result of dehumanization on the part of the villains in those kinds of movies and books.
In one of your books, you talk about the comparison between people and monsters and how that requires both a physical and metaphysical threat.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and define both of those for the audience? More leans over the metaphysical.
Sure. So I think the first point to be made is that in what I consider to be the most dangerous form of dehumanization, which I call demonizing dehumanization, groups of people who are dehumanized are first racialized. And my understanding of the racialization process is simply the idea that these others, whoever they are, they're not subhuman, but they are lower on the scale of human than us, and that this is unalterable. And one of the things that characteristically goes with this, and we can see this again and again and again and again and again in examples spanning history and geography, is that the racialized group is regarded as physically threatening. They are dangerous, they are murderers, they are rapists, they are pedophiles, and so on and so forth. Dehumanization I describe as racism on steroids. Now that's slightly misleading because not all dehumanized groups are racialized, but the sort of dehumanization that leads to genocidal violence virtually always involves racialized. So, what's the link then between racialization and dehumanization? I've said I describe dehumanization as racism on steroids. That is, the group that is first racialized and characterized as a lower grade of humanity is then excluded from the category of the human. So these are not human beings, they're beasts, they're predators, they're vermin, and so on. Now, how does that lead to monsters? Because beasts and vermin are not monsters, right? Well, there's a really important and really extraordinarily significant aspect of dehumanization, which is often missed. And that is that when people dehumanize others, they see them both as dangerous human beings and as less than human creatures. Now, this uncanny combination is what turns them into monsters. That is, well, let's take an example. Let's take the example of werewolves, classic horror fiction trope. Well, what's a werewolf? Well, werewolves are physically threatening, right? Just as wolves can be physically threatening. My grandmother's mother was chased through the forests of Romania by wolves. That's scary. But it's not horrifying. What's horrifying is the notion that a single being could be both human and wolf simultaneously. And this is exactly what happens in cases of dehumanization. Now, this combination of impossible entities, wolf and human, or let's take zombies, they're alive and dead at the same time. This elicits a particular response, which I call metaphysical threat. I call it metaphysical threat because what's going on there is the monster undermines now this is really appropriate to the Crumbling, the very existence of the monster or the imagined existence of the monster undermines our sense of reality. So our idea of the natural order is there are wolves and humans, and something can't be both at the same time, just as like something can't be alive and dead at the same time. But the monster undermines this. And that is profoundly unsettling. So when people are dehumanized, say when the Nazis characterized Jewish people as vermin and Untermenschen, subhumans, and so on, it wasn't simply that they were that they were vermins, but rather that they are vermins in human form. They're an uncanny combination, say, of rat and human. And so we get this element of metaphysical threat. And this element of metaphysical threat, which is consequent on turning people into monsters in this fashion, really magnifies the sort of violence and the sort of terror that greets dehumanized people.
That was the thing from your book that I think stood out the most to me, this idea of the metaphysical threat. I had been trying to put into context, the kinds of things that were happening with transgender people over the last 10 years and myself being transgender. And I was, there wasn't a lot of context for the specific kind of hatred that I think we get that's different, categorically different than other people. And I couldn't quite describe it. And as soon as I heard that word metaphysical threat, I was like, we are something unexpected. We're something that plays with an idea of the natural order. And
exactly. Yeah.
It breaks people when they're told to be broken by it.
For people who essentialize gender, who regard these gender categories as fixed and unchangeable and fundamental, a transgender person is metaphysically threatening. The transgender person is a version of a monster for them because they are combining things which the natural order is supposedly keeping separate.
Yeah, exactly. For my day job, I work in pharmaceuticals, medical science, medical research. And I like to read old research whenever I can. And one of the things that I bumped into at some point was research referring to trans people using terms related to Frankenstein's monster. It was literal. It wasn't like some figurative piece of language. It was say, people are literally being Frankensteined together. And it's really alarming. Our podcast has a thesis where, most of the stories we tell come from a place of examining how we got into some aspect of our current epistemic crisis, which, spans a lot of different fields. And obviously, that's one thing that's made your work compelling to us. And a couple of us recently got to listen to another podcast where you talked about how epistemic authorities, who you would trust to give you knowledge, experts like scientists, journalists, and in some cases, politicians for people, are the ones that often inundate people in dehumanizing rhetoric and create conditions for that. And we spent a bit of time talking about Gamergate before, which, was, for those that aren't aware of it, it was a harassment campaign that started as being about, supposedly about women and their role to play in the culture of people who play video games or commentate on video games. And it got wider and, started targeting more women in general, really. And then we showed the bridge between that and QAnon and what people refer to as the groomer panic. And while QAnon obviously had a few pretty central epistemic authorities, namely the poster or posters named Q and Trump himself and the people that surrounded Trump, the groomer panic didn't really have a normal epistemic authority. Like you had some folks like Chaya Raichik, Libs of TikTok, kind of floating around and some politicians, but a lot of that can be traced back to this 4chan psyop where a bunch of people kind of collectively decided to put that dehumanizing stuff into the atmosphere. And so with that said, do you feel like the move towards like a more decentralized epistemology where we no longer get our news from a set of small sources, but people are more literate in an odd way where we are all kind of making our own news and making our own echo chambers? Do you feel like that's made dehumanization more frequent or more dangerous or hard to counter? Or what's your take on that, how that affects that environment?
Well, if we look back on the history of dehumanization, let's go back to the Middle Ages and the possibilities for circulating dehumanizing propaganda were very, very limited. Most people were illiterate, so it was really works of art and passion plays around Easter time. It's a very inefficient way of distributing propaganda. As literacy became more widespread and we got the Gutenberg press and so on, this sort of stuff could be distributed much more efficiently. Now let's move to the 20th century. One of the Nazis' great insights was the importance of radio for distributing propaganda. Much more effective, much more efficient, much more reach with radio. That's why Goebbels, one of his projects was to manufacture radio receivers that ordinary Germans could afford so they would have the propaganda piped right into their home. And now we have the internet. So with each of these improvements in media, really in the distribution of information, we have improvements in the distribution of misinformation. And yes, indeed, epistemic authority can be distributed. And it actually doesn't require the internet. So, in Southwest Florida, when I was growing up, epistemic authority was definitely distributed. It was the teacher, it was the pastor, it was the sheriff, it was the parents of the kids that I played with, and so on. So we don't have to have a single figure. However, I do think that people have to get us to dehumanize others. They have to be able to disable, at least in part, another feature of being human, which is to recognize the humanness of one another, which as a social species happens automatically. We're really, really good at it, right? So there have to be people who are supposed to know, that's how I like to put it, who can tell us, these others, they might look human, but they're not really human. They're really something else. They're really something else dangerous and disgusting and horrific and we've got to do something about them.
That's definitely, I guess, a part that I hadn't considered is that this was already distributed, and it makes me think of guys like Rush Limbaugh. Even you didn't need too much to get access to guys like that, or conservative newspapers or anything. John Birch Society kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But
and they're all preaching to the choir anyway, right?
Yeah.
These ideological currents, and certainly in American thought, that until fairly recently were socially unacceptable to explicitly articulate. I think one of the things that happened with the Trump regime is that he gave people permission to be authentic, and that's very, very powerful. So things that, I don't know, people would discuss in a bar or on a hunting trip or something have become part of the public sphere.
Yeah. Speaking of that particular bend on things, which things trouble you most? I know this is going to be a huge topic about the current moment we're in.
Well, oh gosh. I mean, what doesn't trouble me most?
Yeah,
that might be the answer. I mean, I see us as now existing in a fascist regime. I've been warning about this since 2015, when all my well-meaning liberal friends, metaphorically speaking, would pat me on the head and say, silly boy, Trump is just entertainment. But I knew too well, having been someone who has studied fascist propaganda, that no, this is a dangerous person, and he's gathered dangerous people around him. And minimally, the damage that is being inflicted on American democracy will, if we're fortunate, take decades to recover from. And we don't have decades, because the thing in the background that really worries me most of all is climate change and the social and political consequences of climate change. And I think there's no way around the conclusion that we will not be able to deal with this. And what we'll have is a perfect storm for fascist regimes, both in the United States and worldwide, doing their thing. I don't do sweetness and light, unfortunately. I don't. I'm pessimistic. I'm hopeful, but I'm pessimistic. And so really that's my story.
That's pretty reasonable. Yeah, I don't think that any of us
super reasonable.
I'm so sad. To add to the last question, do you feel like there's any particularly effective strategies in countering the dehumanization historically, especially while avoiding violence or unnecessary use of authority?
Yeah, good question. My worry is that we've gone too far down the road. I mean, things are set out in the open now that, like I mentioned before, it's not that long ago where they wouldn't be, or, positions are articulated which would have been regarded as unacceptable not too long ago. So look, all of us are situated in some way to do something. I don't think there's a general formula. I do the best I can writing and teaching. You guys do the best you can broadcasting. We, much more generally, I think the sorts of protections that would be great are really under assault. And these are protections like an independent judiciary, freedom of speech, which is being clamped down very severely, particularly in the universities, which have always been resistance, and helplessness. So one of the things that I think makes this sort of propaganda really, really, really powerful is the cultivation of the sense of helplessness in the audience. All right. So Trump is a master of this, and it follows the Nazi playbook to the letter. You get people to feel depressed and bleak, and, with stuff like, we are exploited by everyone, we're the laughing stock of the world, so on and so forth. And then here's where the dehumanization comes in. Well, it's not really you. You're not the problem. The problem is the illegals coming from Latin America, or the woke people, or, the enemy of the moment. They're the problem. If we can just get rid of them, we'll be okay. And then there's what has been called the manic solution. Join us. We will triumph. We will We will get rid of all these dangerous human beings, and life will be paradise. We'll make America great again on the prototype of let's make Germany great again, which was a Nazi slogan. So all of us need to do what we can, depending on how we're situated, to push back against this stuff. Now, I personally think that one of the very, very important things, two very important things. One is, given that these people exploit this sense of helplessness, this is an idea, by the way, I get from Freud, it's very important that people aren't burdened by unnecessary helplessness. That is, that people have enough to eat, they've got jobs, they've got health care, and so on. The undermining of these things really makes the population more receptive to this toxic kind of propaganda. Another, which is under assault and has been under assault for a while by the present regime, is proper education, both historical education and education addressing our own vulnerability to dehumanizing propaganda. You see, it's very tempting to say, oh, it's those bad people over there. It's just those shitty Republicans. They're the only ones. But in fact, given the right pressures, all of us are potential dehumanizers, just as we're potential victims of dehumanization. And it's absolutely the wrong attitude to dehumanize the dehumanizers, to say, these are monsters, they're not like us. Yeah, they are like us. That's part of the problem that we're wrestling with. So that's one bit of education for people to recognize this. The other is, and I'm afraid, this is really terribly under assault now, is proper historical education. Every group of people in the world, somewhere along the line, has blood on their hands. That's just a fact about how human beings have conducted themselves. And every group of people also are tempted to minimize the degree to which they've harmed others. And this is certainly true in the United States. It's true in spades in the United States, because by and large, Americans have got away with it. We're not like the Germans. The Germans didn't get away with it. We've gotten away with it. Proper historical education induces a kind of sense of humility. Oh my God, we did this. We did this to people. That means we're capable of doing this to people. That means maybe we'll do it again, or maybe we're doing it now. We don't even recognize it. I think that's really, really important and horribly underemphasized. I teach a course on race and racism to undergraduate students at the University of New England. And I can tell you, they come into this course incredibly ignorant about the horrendous history of racialization. And I tell them the first day, look, what you're going to learn straight away, it's way worse than you ever imagined and you were ever taught. That, I think, is crucial, and that is really, really under attack.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about, not only, in between the set of us as co-hosts on the show. Part of this came out of Davin and I making phone calls to each other over a long period of a few years, talking about how the hell we got here. I grew up evangelical and kind of, in the cult environment. And, by the time I got out, I had realized that I had a lot of unlearning and a lot of learning to do. And that kind of, spurred a lot of curiosity in me. And I'm very lucky that people in my life emphasize that. But I tend to think, a lot about how we got here. And it's sort of been, very hard to pinpoint a time when I had grown up in the Bush era mostly. I'm in my late 30s now. And I remember seeing people, carted off to CIA black sites in Guantanamo Bay and all of these other things, and being like, hey, don't you think this creates a condition for worse things to happen? And then, I end up reading, Howard Zinn and all of these other things and say, oh, well, this has really been an issue for a lot of time. But I was going to ask you, do you think there are people that are, particularly responsible for where we are now, in terms of dehumanization, in terms of the current historical moment? Or is this more of a birds coming home to roost kind of thing.
Well, I think it's a little of both. I'm assuming you're asking about the United States.
Yes, yeah.
Americans have never, they've never properly addressed things. Like I said, we've gotten away with it. This profound current of a particularly toxic kind of conservatism, a particularly toxic kind of religious fundamentalism, a particularly toxic kind of racism has been bubbling away, under the surface forever in this country and periodically erupts. And there are clever people, either in positions of power who wish to be in positions of power, who exploit these sentiments, which are there. It's it's a festering wound that's never been lanced, and I'm afraid that's the coming home to roost bit.
Yeah. One thing I will notice is that, in the years leading up to Trump running, especially maybe, 2012 through 2015, obviously there were other fascist movements on the rise in other places. And that was one of the things that, clued me off that we may be headed for that, watching La Front National kind of become sanitized and the Golden Dawn in Greece and all these other things.
Yeah.
But in America, I felt like we were starting to talk about that history, that really ugly festering wound that we have in us. And like around 2012, that stuff really started to bubble up, especially more youth culture, folks that were a bit younger than me through like social networks like Tumblr and stuff like that, where people, Twitter is, that sort of micro-blogging kind of thing. But on Tumblr, you had people writing, veritable journal entries and sharing them with people. And you started to get these younger folks that are reading like critical theory and these kinds of things. It's really incredible as a historical movement and sort of talking about our history a lot more openly. People with, certain kinds of expertise were talking on there. I even saw some other engineers on there talking about fluid dynamics and things. But it seemed like the history thing was really starting to get talked about. And it almost seemed like the conservatism of the time became sort of this allergic reaction to that, where it was no, stuff that back down.
Indeed. Yeah. It's backlash. And of course, part of it is also backlash from the Obama presidency as well, which, I predicted at the time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Is there anything happening right now that gives you hope about the current situation?
Oh,
that
that's
will probably be gigantic.
That's your upbeat voice, V. I'm afraid it doesn't work. I said I'm hopeful, but not optimistic. What do I mean by that? Well, we have to give things our best shot, and maybe I'm wrong in my pessimism and so on. And, people like you getting me to come and talk about these things. Gradually dehumanization is being taken more seriously. It's more on the radar than it was in the past. It was in the past in a very crude way. But look, this is like something we really need to understand. We really need to theorize, because if we don't do that, we can't do anything about it, right? So that this interest is spreading, affects my hopefulness a little bit, but I don't want to exaggerate this. We're in a very, very serious, very dangerous position, in my view. I don't think looking on the bright side is particularly helpful. We need to, hunker down and push back as much as we can in whatever way we're situated in doing. Now, if I can introduce one other thing, which is an utterly hopeless project, but I think would be very, very important if it could be accomplished, is, remember I said groups of people are generally racialized before being dehumanized. Well, if I'm what's called a race skeptic. I don't believe in race. I think it's an evil invention. My wife, who's a Jamaican philosopher, Sabrina Smith, feels the same sort of way. If we could get rid of this notion of race, which is not just to prevent misunderstanding, to be skeptical about the reality of race is not the same as being skeptical of the reality of racism. I think that would go a long way towards putting up some guardrails against dehumanization, given that intimate relationship between racialization and dehumanization. But people cling to the notion of race so tenaciously, I think that is maybe 500 years down the line, if we last that long, something like that could happen.
That's a very interesting perspective that you've brought in. And I'll be honest, I usually when someone talks about race is not a thing, it's always followed, or not going to say always because you have broken that rule. It's typically followed up with some sort of, I do the color blindness rule, where it's like, race is not a thing, therefore what you say is an impact of racism does not exist.
And that's ridiculous. Yeah.
And so I've never heard it put so well where you say like, hey, race shouldn't really be a thing, but racism is clearly a thing. Maybe we can like work about like, let's get rid of the racism so then we can live in a post-racial society, which everybody and their mother thought was going to happen after Obama. But look at where we're at. Look at where we're at.
Other directions.
Yeah. So just thank you for expounding on that, because I've truly never heard it that way, or in a way where I'm like, okay, I can kind of believe in that, because this is just my comment on it. I feel like race in itself, for a variety of good and bad reasons, gives people a sense of comfort and identity in a world that's continuously being, at least in an American sense, a lot of individualism. You don't get, right? Like, sometimes it used to be someone's like little small town gave them identity, but now small towns don't have third spaces, or we're increasingly online. The one thing that in the American context you can always fall back on is I am X, I am Y, I am Z, for all the good and bad of it.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, is going to be like the tough thing, because it for a lot of people, for good and bad reasons, it's a centerpiece of their identity and cultural heritage.
Yeah. And that's why I said maybe 500 years from now, in a society like the United States, where we're all marinated in racial ideology, it becomes built into people's identities very, very early on. And in that way, it becomes something precious, right? And you know, with someone like Sabrina, my spouse, and I come along and say, this is real toxic stuff. Let's look at the history of the death toll accumulated in the name of race, and put it on a balance. And it's horrendous, but people readily and understandably feel like we're trying to rob them of something precious, and that's not what we want to do, right? There are other ways of consolidating identity than this notion of race, which is basically invented by people who wanted to have a pretext of harming other people.
Yeah. I feel like some people were starting to get at that a little bit more publicly when people started talking about how whiteness is kind of this constructed identity, right? Like, where, at one point, whiteness was like just white Anglo-Saxons and some Germans, and then whiteness started to include
Italians and Irish people,
and then Italians, and then by maybe 100 years from now, I don't know, maybe
Cubans are going to be next.
It's gonna be
it's going to be like Cubans and I believe East Asians will be acceptable.
Yeah.
Like, you now get to be in like the white club.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So one of my worries about the language of whiteness, again, it leads people to reify the notion of race itself, right? These are white people. They're in the white group. I think we need to be very, very, very vigilant about this, because it has such a powerful grip on the human imagination. So look, my wife was brought up in Jamaica, moved to the UK when she was 19, and then we got married in the UK, and we moved to the United States. And she often says, I didn't become black till I came to the US. That is, in Jamaica, of course, there are words like black and white, but they didn't carry this kind of baggage, this metaphysical baggage that these terms carry in the United States. Anyway, if we could get rid of that shit, I think we'd be in a better position.
The funny thing is, and Sophia, I'm so glad I can make this comment now that you've seen the movie Sinners. This feels very much like a conversation Remick would have.
Yeah.
David, have you seen the movie Sinners?
Not yet, not yet. I've been reading about it.
Please go see it. And the conversation we just had is a through line of the movie in this like very unique way.
Oh, awesome.
I'm sorry, all I can think of is just like Remic's speech at the end, Sophia, when he's baptizing Preacher Boy. And it's just like, I got chills from it too.
Yeah.
In the same way.
Oh yeah. Saul Williams being in that movie got me because I love his poetry and have for a very long time. But anyway, well, we're gonna do 3 more kind of quick questions. So, V, I'm gonna pass these to you.
Okay. What differences do you see between the dehumanization of trans people in the United States and really all over and past campaigns of dehumanization, if any? And on the same topic, what similarities do you see?
Okay, so let me preface this by saying I haven't properly studied the dehumanization of trans people. I have some views on this, but I try not to talk out of my ass when I'm talking about these important things. So there is a crucial difference. Trans people are very often represented as monstrous beings, as are dehumanized people in the very strict sense that I use the term. So I guess I should say I'm a real big fan of making distinctions. I distinguish dehumanization from racism, from transphobia, from sexism, from various other nasty isms that we should try and get rid of. And I make these distinctions because I think all of these things have their special and unique dynamics. And if we want to deal with them, if we want to get rid of them, as we all should, we need to pop the hood and, look at the motor, like what is driving these things. And if we find similar things are driving them, fine. But I think we should treat them all individually, right? So with respect to attitude towards trans people definitely elicit in a wide swathe of the population this sense of metaphysical threat, as we described earlier. It's not a sense of metaphysical threat that emerges from seeing the other as both human and subhuman simultaneously. It's a different kind of metaphysical threat, and it's a metaphysical threat that comes from seeing the other as male and female simultaneously, either through visual cues or for simply on the basis of knowledge that they are trans people, right? So that's a little bit different than, say, the dehumanization of African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century. One of my areas is studying lynching and the dehumanization of lynching victims, where these men, and they were almost all men, like at least 97% of the lynching victims in the American South were men, were explicitly described as subhuman creatures, right? So they were uncanny combinations of human and subhuman. Trans people elicit metaphysical threat through being perceived as uncanny combinations of male and female. So that, in a nutshell, are the similarities and the differences as I see them now. This is one of the many things I want to be able to research much more thoroughly. Yeah.
Specifically relating to like a Florida lawmaker.
It's on my Substack. Titled Trans Demonic.
Yeah, he referred to us as mutants and brought up the X-Men and everything, which of course it's kind of funny because the X-Men is this story about dehumanization of people, and that's really the whole through line in that series. Especially after they had made it so that Magneto was a Holocaust survivor and all these things, like it's really baked into the story. So there was a weird sense of irony there, but I'm going to give you our last question, and then we'll let you get going. By the way, thank you so much for spending time with us. This has been wonderful.
It's a pleasure. It's really great. I appreciate it very much.
But I guess another thing that maybe could be hopeful, but if, let's say that, somebody gave you the keys to the car and they said you could pass one policy overnight, what would it be?
Oh, God. I'm going to have to give an honest answer to this. I don't know. I really don't know. If someone gave me the keys to the car, I would consult the smartest people that I could find to make that call. Because it's not a simple it's not a simple question.
Yeah.
Like, where are we going to get the most bang for the buck in terms of halting this horrible march of fascism and dehumanization? I don't know.
Honestly, that's a better answer than I think most could give anyway. Some people have a quick fix or just a top priority, but honestly, the intellectual humility of just saying, I don't know, that's also a great answer. I feel very blessed that, a friend of mine who's running for Congress recently, asked me to help write some policy. And it was really hard to decide, what do you say?
What do you say? We're dealing with such complicated things.
Yeah.
And people don't really understand, the social phenomena and political phenomena are so complex that I think we should mistrust anyone who offers simple, confident solutions to the mess that we're in here.
Yeah, it does seem like, hubris is kind of an overarching thing in this whole problem too, somebody thinking that they can go from failing a casino to running a country, it does feel, like maybe a drunk guy behind the wheels, because I don't think many else would have that kind of overconfidence.
I always thought I was a confident person, but even then, we don't have that level.
Me neither.
All right.
So we're all going to do the best we can, right?
Exactly.
That's all we can do.
Yeah.
All right. Do you guys have anything else you want to say? Anything you want to plug? Anything you'd like our audience to know?
Well, yeah. If they find this stuff interesting, they should read my books. But short of reading my books, subscribe to my Substack. I don't have anything behind a paywall. This stuff is too urgent to be, concealed behind paywalls. So drop by.
For sure. Yeah, we'll put links to all of that stuff in the show notes, and that way folks can get access. Deeply urge you to read these books. I have only read a few books in my lifetime that I've said are essential, and I think the ones that I keep harping on recently are your second one, Making Monsters, and at least in that kind of series of the three, and The Rebel by Albert Camus. Those are the two.
Well, I'm deeply honored. I truly am.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure, and keep up the wonderful work you guys are doing.
Thank you so
didn't
much.
know about the Crumbling before you contacted me, but I know about it now, and I've been enjoying listening to it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Glad to hear that.
Thank you.